the draft. It provides you with the framework for your decision making and gives you a way to plot out your own decisions and the decisions of your opponents as the draft goes on. So one of the common ways to set up a draft board is with a spreadsheet like Excel. And I'm going to demonstrate how to use Excel to create the foundation of your draft board. For me, the foundation really comes down to three essential factors: value-based drafting rankings, positional tiers, and ADP. There's other pieces of information, obviously, that you can include, but these are the absolute essentials that you really need to have at your disposal. So the first step is to calculate or acquire your VBD relative values. VBD is something you should become familiar with because while it's not the end-all be-all that it may have been in the past, it really provides you with the ability to compare all the players available to you regardless of position. I'm going to assume that all of you watching are familiar with VBD. So the first step obviously is to input my VBD rankings into Excel. That's the first column here. It's basically one long list of all the positional players available to me throughout the draft. As you can see, I have them ranked based on the relative value of each player. Don't mind any of the values in any of this. It's all made up. So basically I have one complete list that includes every position. I included a dividing line after every 12 players just to have a visual idea of how many players have been picked and in general which round the draft is in. In a 12-team draft, obviously there are 12 players picked each round. So from the next step is to account for positional scarcity. That's another essential term in terms of fantasy strategy. Scarcity refers to the concept of supply and demand, basically. My roster requires a certain number of players to start at each position. For example, I might only need to start one quarterback. In 2 quarterback leagues, I'll need to start 2. I might need to start 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 3 wide receivers, so on and so forth. So the scarcity of each position depends on the number of players at each position I'm required to start, the amount of teams in my league, potential injury risk, and various other factors. But the best way to visualize scarcity throughout the draft is by creating tiered rankings for each position. So that's what I've got here. Not only do I have the overall rankings, I also have my rankings by position. Some might say, well, I could just go down the first list and use that solely, the overall list that you have. You can, but the problem I've always found is that it's much more difficult to keep track of the number of players available to you at each position. And it's really difficult, especially when you consider that you may have only between 30 and 60 seconds to actually make your pick during the actual draft. So as you can see, I have each player charted by position. I have their overall rank next to their name. And it's just another easily recognizable visual I'm going to have as I go through my draft. So I've also included projected points per game. Like I said, these are all made up values, so don't mind them. So now I have all my running backs, all my wide receivers, all my tight ends, all my quarterbacks in the tiers. Now I haven't actually divided them up into tiers. Now tiers are essential because, as you can see, I have a long list of all these guys in each position. But that doesn't mean that for example, the number 4 running back is just as good or just slightly better than the number 5 running back. The only way we can really determine that is by creating the tiers. So the third essential factor that I mentioned was the ADP. ADP is something that seems to be misused by a lot of novice players. When I first started using it, it was the one thing that I focused on the most. But the reason I have the ADP there is not so much to have an idea of where each player may be drafted, because it certainly doesn't matter where they have been drafted leading up to your own draft. That really has no bearing on where they will be drafted. But the reason I use it is because if you're an online draft, the default setting used to rank players is generally set by the ADP. That's what you'll get when you go into the interface of ESPN or Yahoo or whatever drafting tool you're using. So you get into the draft interface, and most people just use this base a lot of their decisions on this ADP ranking without creating or importing their own rankings or even switching the setting to something else. So essentially it's utilizing some game theory. I know that some of my opponents are looking almost exclusively at that ADP ranking, so it helps me project their next moves, which in turn helps me determine my next move. So for example, I may want to select player A right now, but I see that the person selecting after me has been taking one of the top 4 or 5 guys based on ADP each time. So if the player I want is farther down that list, then I know I have a good chance that I can probably take someone else, and the player I really want will still be there the next round. So that's how I use ADP. Here we have the tiers. The dividing lines basically make up each tier. So where you see, for example, Todd Gurley and Adrian Peterson in one tier, Le'Veon Bell's in the next tier all by himself, David Johnson, Devontae Freeman, Doug Martin in another tier. These dividing lines really give you an idea of where there's a drop-off between one player and the next. If you only rank players from 1 to 100 or 1 to 200, you really don't have an idea of where there's a drop-off, especially within the position. So this really gives you a great visual to use during the draft. So once the draft starts, color coding is a big thing that I use. It lets me know who's been drafted, who's still available, and the way I do it is by shading in the different players as they get picked. Not only on my overall list, but obviously in the positional list too. So say I have the 4th pick. The top 3 guys are already gone: Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham, Julio Jones. I make my pick of Todd Gurley. I color him in green, signifying that he's mine. As the draft goes on, obviously more players get taken. And as you can see, having the overall list as well as the tiers really gives you a better visualization of what kind of players are available in each position, especially with the tiers. You can see that there's a drop-off every few players. And I know that I've got 2 running backs already, Doug Martin and Todd Gurley. I don't have a wide receiver, but I can see that Alshon Jeffrey is still there. And I have him ranked higher than a couple guys already taken. So that way it gives me a great idea of what my next move really needs to be.